The auctioneer's gavel had already come down and moved on to the next lot when Miriam Kell raised her hand, and the whole yard turned to look at her the way a town looks at someone who has just done a thing it will talk about for years to come. 65 ewes stood crowded in the far pen, ribs stacked like barrel staves under wool gone the color of old ash, their heads hanging low, and she had bought every last one of them for $28. Not $28 apiece, which would have been foolish enough. $28 for the whole staggering lot. The man beside her laughed so hard he had to catch himself against the rail and wipe his eyes with the back of his wrist, and somewhere behind her a woman said, loud enough that it was meant to carry, that a young widow with no man and no sense to speak of would do better to burn the money in the stove. Miriam did not turn around. She had learned long ago that turning around to answer was how you gave a thing your strength. She stood at the rail and watched the sheep instead, and what she saw, though she could not yet have put a name to it, was not a pen full of dying animals waiting to fall down. It was a pen full of noses that had already lifted, all of them, all 65, pointed away from the water trough and the fresh-cut hay, pointed together toward the dry brown flank of a hill that nobody in that whole county had bothered to think about in 30 years. She held that sight in her mind and paid no attention to the laughing, and if you had asked her in that moment whether she was afraid, she would have told you the truth, which was yes. But fear, she had found, was only another number to be counted against, and she was very good at counting. 2 springs earlier, there had been a man beside her, and a farm that was half his and half the bank's, and a plan that had seemed in the ordinary way of plans made by the young and the hopeful, entirely sound. Thomas Kell had been a kind man and a strong one, quicker to laugh than to reckon, and he had believed the valley would be gentle with them because he intended to be gentle with it. Then he had gone into the creek bottom after a strayed heifer in the high water of a March flood, waiting where he should have waited, and the brown water had taken him and had not given him back until it was 3 days too late to matter. The plan went into the creek with him. What was left when the county was finished with its papers and the bank in Ledford was finished with its patience was 160 acres of the worst ground in the Ossaw Valley, a house with a roof that talked to itself all night in the wind, and a debt of $410 that the bank expected to see reduced by autumn, or it expected to see the deed signed over. Miriam was 26 years old. She had been raised on a poorer place than this one, in a poorer state than this one, the eldest of too many children, in a house where the winter was a thing you survived rather than a thing you enjoyed. She had a way of standing very still and looking at a hard thing for a long while before she said anything about it, which the people of Ledford had already decided among themselves was pride, when in plain fact it was only arithmetic being done behind a quiet face. She had learned young that hunger changes a household the way frost changes a window pane, quietly and then all at once, and she had learned that you did not argue with hunger. You counted against it coin by coin and day by day, and you did not stop. So she counted. $410 owed, with the bank's clerk marking the months off on his ledger like a man ticking off the fingers of a hand he meant to close into a fist. $31 in a tin box behind the stove, which was every dollar she had in the world. 160 acres, of which perhaps 40 could grow anything a person might actually want to put in a mouth, and the rest of which rose up behind the house in a long dry shoulder of hill that the previous owner had called the Bald, and that the county surveyor had marked on his neat official map with a single flat and final word: unwatered. There had been a well once up near the crown of it, and there had been a spring below the well, and both had failed in the great dry summer that the old-timers still spoke of, and neither had ever come back. And so the Bald had gone first to the sheep of men too poor to afford better grass, and then to no sheep at all, and then to Thomas Kell, as part of a bargain he had thought uncommonly clever, land thrown in near, for free with the good bottom acres he truly wanted. Miriam walked that hill in the second week of her widowhood with her skirts pinned up and her dead husband's boots swimming loose on her feet, and she found cracked clay that broke into curling plates underfoot, and gray sage that smelled of dust, and the pale bones of old thistle rattling in the wind. And she found, near the middle of the long slope where the ground dipped into a shallow bowl the size of a small room, a place where the sage grew a hand's breadth taller than anywhere else, and greener down at the root than sage had any business being. She stood there a long time looking at it, feeling something turn slowly over in the back of her mind. Then she walked back down the hill and told no one what she had seen, because she had not the first idea yet what it meant. She might have stood puzzling in that bowl for a whole year without ever understanding it, if it had not been for old Bartek Noack, who farmed the quarter section that lay to the east of hers, and who had come, 40 years before, out of a country whose name the men in Ledford could neither pronounce nor be bothered to learn. Bartek was near 70 now, brown and bent as an old fence post left too long in the weather, and he spoke a slow and careful English that was seeded all through with the grammar of somewhere far away, so that his sentences turned in odd and thoughtful directions. He had watched Thomas Kell buy the bald 2 springs back, and had said nothing at the time, because in his country a man did not lecture another man about the bargain he had already struck. But he came to Miriam's fence one evening while she was mending a broken rail, uninvited and entirely unhurried, and he leaned his forearms on the top of the fence and looked up at the hill with his old eyes narrowed against the last of the light, and after a while he said, "The land is never poor. Only misread." Miriam straightened up with the hammer still in her hand and told him the county had marked it unwatered on the map. Bartek laughed at that, a dry, small sound like 2 sticks knocked together. "The county," he said, "writes down what a man tells them, and a man tells them what he saw. The one year that he gave up, he tapped the rail with one thick finger. 'Water does not die,' he said. 'Water only learns to go quiet.' He tapped again, slower. 'And an animal, a hungry animal, it will find the quiet water in the ground when a rich man's map has already given up looking.' Then he told her as easily as if it were the most obvious counsel in the world, that she ought to get herself sheep. Not good sheep, poor sheep. The poorest and cheapest she could lay her hands on, because poor sheep cost almost nothing, and poor sheep are desperate, and desperate feet dig. She did not understand him then, not all the way, and she said as much, plainly. Bartek only shrugged his bent shoulders and told her that understanding was a thing which came after the doing and never once before it, and then he wished her a good night and went home to his own supper, leaving her standing at the fence with the hammer hanging forgotten in her hand. But one word had lodged itself in her like a burr in wool, and the word was dig, and that night by the light of the stove she did her arithmetic all over again with that new figure worked into it. A flock of sheep, even poor half-dead ones, meant wool come the spring and lambs come the year after, and mutton on the table if it came down to that, and manure enough to wake the 40 good acres from their long sleep, and, if the old man was right, and she truly did not yet believe that he was, it meant feet. Hundreds upon hundreds of small, hard-cloven feet, working at a hillside. Day after day after day after day, she had $31. She could not buy good sheep, and turning it over, she found that she did not even want them. She wanted precisely the sort of animal the whole world had already given up on, because the whole world had given up on her, too, the widow alone on the worst quarter in the valley, and she had noticed something in her hard young life that the comfortable never seemed to notice, which was that giving up on a thing was mostly just a failure of looking closely enough at it. So when the notice was tacked up outside the mercantile that the Doyle place was to be sold off to satisfy its debts, and that among the lots to go under the gavel was a flock of scrub ewes, half dead from a winter of pure neglect, Miriam Kell washed her one good dress and put it on and rode the 11 long miles to the auction yard. And she took her place at the rail, and she waited for the laughing to begin. It began before the bidding did. Everyone in 3 townships knew her by then, the widow who would not sell to the parade of men who kept turning up in her lane with their low and kindly worded offers, the stubborn woman alone on the worst ground in the whole Ossaw. When the scrub ewes were driven up in their sorry knot and the auctioneer called for an opening bid and got back only silence and a few thrown jeers, Miriam said, clear and level, $28. There was a full beat of astonished quiet before the noise of it broke over the yard. A cattle agent named Harlan Voss laughed the loudest of all of them. A broad, soft-handed man in a good broadcloth coat who bought and sold beasts across 3 counties, and who had already, on 2 separate occasions, driven out to offer to take the Kell place off the poor grieving widow's hands for a sum that would have left her with the clothes on her back and nothing else. He came sauntering over while the yard boy was cutting the flock out from the pen, and he arranged his face into the warm and fatherly smile he kept for such uses, and he said, "Mrs. End quote. Cull, I do admire your spirit, truly I do, but a woman all on her own simply cannot nurse 65 dying sheep back into anything at all, but a deeper hole in the ground than the one she's already standing in. Sell me the whole place, sheep and land and hill together, and go somewhere a body can draw an easy breath." She turned her still long look on him and let it rest until he shifted his weight, and then she said, "Thank you, no." She counted out her $28 in hard coin into the clerk's palm, leaving her but $3 in all the world, and she drove her staggering, stumbling flock the 11 miles home through the summer dust while the whole town watched her go and agreed among themselves, with the awful cheerful certainty of people watching another soul walk toward ruin, that they had just witnessed a fool spend the last of her money on the digging of her own grave. They were not altogether wrong about the state of those sheep. 9 of them died inside the first 2 weeks, one after another, and Miriam dug a grave for every one of them in the hard ground, and would not let herself weep over the arithmetic of the loss, though the arithmetic was cruel indeed, because 9 sheep out of 65 was a full share of everything her $28 had purchased. The remaining 56 she nursed with a stubbornness that frightened even herself in the long, dark hours before dawn. She was up before the first gray light every single morning, carrying water in 2 pails from the house well down to the pens, cutting what poor thin hay she had with a hand scythe until her shoulders burned, and dosing the very sickest of them with a bitter dark tea that Bartek had taught her to boil down from certain bark and certain root. Her hands, which not so long ago had been the smooth hands of a young married woman, went rough as bark themselves, cracked open at every knuckle, and never again entirely clean. And here is the thing that she noticed, the thing that kept her going when the counting turned black in the night. The surviving 56 ewes, weak and wasted as they still were, would not stay down in the good pasture where she penned them each evening. Every day, no matter how she drove them, they drifted, dragging their bony legs up onto the flank of the bald, up and up toward that shallow bowl of taller, greener sage. And there they would stand in the very worst of the noon heat, with their noses jammed down into the cracked clay, pawing at it, stamping, working it the way a dog works at something buried. She would climb up and drive them all down again. By the next morning, they were up there again. Bartek came and stood beside her one evening and watched them do it. And he said, "Only, you see." And she said she saw feet and dust and a hill that could not be watered. And the old man nodded and said one word, "Wait." She waited. She worked and she waited, and by the time June came around the flock had begun, against every hard prediction the town had made, to mend. The ribs still showed, but the eyes had cleared of their dull film, and new wool was coming in over the old ash-colored fleece, the way fresh green grass comes in over ground that has been burned. She had a girl helping her by then, a thin and quiet child of 11 years, named Sarah Paul, whose family had one too many mouths at their table, and one too few good fields to feed them, and who had come first to the door, only to beg a little work in trade for a little food, and had stayed on because she loved those sheep with the whole fierce, undivided heart that children keep in reserve for animals when the grown people around them have proven a disappointment. It was Sarah who named the entire flock, every ewe of it, 65 names in all, though 9 of them were now only names spoken over graves, and who could tell one from another at a single glance across the pasture where Miriam still saw only a mass of sheep. And it was Sarah who came flying down the hillside one blistering noon in July, screaming for Miriam at the top of her small lungs, not in fear, but in a wild, high joy, shouting over and over that the ground was crying. The ground was crying. Come quick and see. Miriam dropped the pail she was carrying and ran, her heart hammering hard against her ribs, certain the child had fallen or trodden on a rattlesnake, and she came laboring up over the lip of the shallow bowl and stopped dead. And the endless anxious arithmetic that had run in the back of her mind for 2 years, the sheep had opened the hill, where they had pawed and stamped and worked at that dished-out bowl for 2 solid months, dragging away the packed crust of dead clay a single hoofful at a time. They had at last worn the ground down to a dark and glistening seam, and out of that dark seam, in the driest month of the driest summer, the whole valley had seen in more than a decade. Water had come, not a gush of it, not a leaping fountain. A seep, a slow and steady weeping, of clear cold water out of the broken clay, gathering in the low belly of the bowl into a pool no bigger across than a wagon wheel, its muddy edges already ringed with green, already crowded 3 deep with the flock, drinking as though they had known all along exactly what they were about, as though they had been telling her the whole time, in the only language they had been given, where the answer lay. Bartek's old failed spring had not died in the great dry summer of legend after all. It had only learned to go quiet, the way he had said, sealed over beneath a lid of packed clay that no drought could crack and no plow could ever reach, but that 65 pairs of desperate starving feet, working the same square yard, day after day after day, had finally stamped clean open. Miriam knelt down at the muddy edge of the little pool and pushed her rough, cracked hands into the cold of the water, and she began, very quietly, so that the joyful child beside her would not see it and be frightened, to shake all over. She did not tell the town. She banked the knowledge low inside herself, like a coal buried under ash, the way she had quietly banked every small victory all along the hard road, because she had learned in her bones that a thing announced to the world too soon is a thing the world will straightway find some clever way to take back from you. She dug out the seep with great care under Bartek's slow, patient direction, clearing the choked old channel of the buried spring stone by stone, and she walled the pool around with flat rocks carried up from the creek bottom, and she led the overflow away in a narrow ditch that ran along the level contour of the bald, so that the precious water spread itself thin across the whole hungry slope rather than running uselessly straight off the bottom. And the hill, which the county had branded unwatered in its official hand, which the previous owner had cursed and the auction crowd had pitied her so freely for buying, began to change before her eyes. Green followed the water downhill. By August, the bowl and the length of its ditch were ringed with grass standing a foot high, and the flock, which had come to her as 65 bundles of loose bone in a dust cloud, now ranged fat and glossy fleeced across a slope that was turning day by day, the color of hope itself. She cut wild hay off ground that had grown nothing but bitter sage for a full generation. And still, she said not one word about it down in Ledford. And still, she paid a little of the debt down each month out of the small sale of wool and the first 3 healthy lambs, and still Harlan Voss came driving up her lane with his soft, warm face and his slowly rising offers, and still she said only, "Thank you," and watched something sour and curdle behind his pale eyes each time the words left her mouth. Then the sky did the very thing that old Bartek had been reading in it, muttering over since May. The rains that ought to have come in the late summer did not come, and the rains that ought to have come in the fall did not come after them either, and by the following July, the entire Ossaw Valley lay flattened under a drought, the like of which even the oldest settlers had to reach far back into their childhoods to match. The creeks that fed the good rich farms down in the bottom, the very farms of the men who had laughed hardest at the auction rail, went first to a thin trickle and then to strings of green and stinking pools, and then at last to cracked bare stone that rang underfoot. The wells that every family in the county had trusted their lives to, dug deep in the fat wet years, dropped and dropped, until the buckets came up half mud and then came up nothing at all. Harlan Voss's own leased pastures burned brown from fence to fence, and the cattle he had scattered across his 3 counties began to bawl day and night for water, and then began to die outright for the want of it, their carcasses swelling along the dry watercourses. The fat, easy certainty went out of the whole town like air out of a punctured bladder. It is always easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit out loud that you were a fool to mock it, and so it took the people of Ledford a long time, far longer than it ought to have taken them, to remember the widow up on the bald. But hunger changes a town exactly the way it changes a single household, quietly at first and then all at once. And there came at last a morning when a man drove his wagon up Miriam Kell's rutted lane with his tongue-swollen horses staggering in the traces, and he pulled them to a halt, and he sat there and stared up at the hill with his mouth hanging open. Because the bald was green. In all that dead brown dying valley, in the very teeth of the drought that was killing the low rich ground the county had so confidently called good, the one hill that the county had called unwatered stood green from the seep clear down to the flat, its pool full and cold and steady as a heartbeat, its grass tall enough to lie down in, its flock, grown now to near 100 head with the season's lambs, spread fat and unbothered across the whole slope. The buried spring, the one the drought of legend had supposedly killed, dead, had never once depended on the rain at all. Bartek explained it to her slowly, patiently, once she had come to understand the shape of it herself. It was fed from far off and from deep, from snow water falling in hills 100 miles distant, water that took long, slow years to travel down through the stone before it seeped up into the light, and it had only gone quiet in that first dry summer, because the surface above it had sealed itself over with clay, and the fools who came after had read nothing but the sealed, dry surface and written unwatered in their books and never once thought to dig. The drought that was now taking every creek and every well that drank straight from the sky could not so much as touch water that welled up from the deep and patient places of the earth, and Miriam Kell, who had paid $28 for 65 starving ewes and been laughed at for it before the whole county, stood at the crown of her green hill and looked down over a valley of thirsting animals and thirsting people, and she understood, with a calm that surprised her, that she now held in her 2 rough hands the single thing in the whole country that everyone alive needed, and that no one else on earth had. She could have named any price she pleased. Harlan Voss understood that plain fact before any of the rest of them did, being a man whose entire life had been the cold reading of exactly this kind of leverage over other people, and he came up her lane, not in his fine broadcloth coat this time, but sweating through his shirt sleeves, and the warm fatherly smile was altogether gone from his face. And in the place where it had been, there was something raw and naked. He offered first to buy the water alone. Then, when she said nothing, he offered to buy the whole hill. Then at last, in a voice that had lost every trace of its old condescension, the way a flooded field loses its neat furrows, he offered to buy the entire place outright for $1,100, near 3 full times what she still owed the bank, and she could see in his frightened eyes that he would go higher yet if she only waited. That, the man who had come twice to take her farm for a song, was now openly begging her to save his dying cattle at any cost he had to pay. And there it was, laid out clean and complete before her, the exact moment that the whole hard-grinding 2 years had been walking her steadily toward all along. She could sell him the water alone, and let a man like that corner every drop of it, and price every desperate farmer in the valley straight into the ground, and take her fat cut off the top of their ruin, and be, inside a single season, one of the richest and most thoroughly hated people in 3 counties. She stood very still and looked at him for a long, long while. In that way the town had always so wrongly called pride, and she did her arithmetic one final time, all of it, and it came out, to her own quiet surprise, entirely different from the sum a frightened, greedy man would have run. She said no. She told him she would not sell him the water, not for his $1,100 and not for $11,000, because water was not a thing that any one person on this earth ought to own the whole of, while a whole valley of families died of thirst around them. And then she told him, and she told the crowd of men who had gathered up behind him, with their hats crushed in their hands. The very same men who had laughed at her at the rail 2 summers gone. What she meant to do instead. She would open the bald. Any family in the whole valley could bring their surviving stock to water at the Seep in an orderly turn on days that she and Bartek together would set out and keep, and it would cost them not 1 cent, nothing but the labor of their own backs in helping her dig the pool wider and run more ditch across the slope, so that the green would spread further and hold more animals, and more water and more life, through the dry months to come. To those few who could pay a little for the wintering of a handful of beasts on her good grass, she would charge a little, a fair price and not a penny more, a price that a hungry, proud man could meet and still keep his pride whole. And to Harlan Voss himself, she said just one thing more, quietly, so quietly that only the nearest men caught it, and then carried it out to all the rest. She said, "You offered me 1,100 just now, standing in my yard. But 2 summers back you offered me a sum for the whole of this, sheep and land and hill, all together, that would have left me with the clothes on my back, and you laughed in my face the entire while you did it." She let those words sit and settle in the dusty air. "Now how did you know?" she asked him. "How well did you already know what this place was truly worth, to come pressing me at all, if you had only read the same map that the county read?" And Harlan Voss's soft face went the exact gray color of the dead cracked clay, because in the panic of his thirst and his fear, he had let slip the one thing above all others, that he should have kept buried, that he had known the old failed spring lay sleeping under the bald all along, and had spent 2 full years trying to steal the hill cheap out from under a widow he had judged far too green and far too alone to ever learn what precious thing she was standing on. The men gathered around him, heard every word of it. The whole valley had heard it by nightfall. And there is no fate on this earth crueler for a man of Harlan Voss's particular kind than to be exposed as a greedy schemer in front of the very people whose admiration he had counted on all his life. And he sold off what cattle he had left for whatever they would bring, and left the Ossaw Valley for good before the drought had even broken. And he never once came back to it. The rains returned the next spring, as the rains always do return in the end, and the creeks filled and the wells rose and the low ground turned itself green once more, and in the fullness of time, some of the very men who had watered their last surviving beasts at Miriam Kell's, Seep through the worst of the dying, went back to talking as though they had always privately known. She had good sound sense in her. That is the way of towns, and she did not hold it against them, having long since learned that people forgive themselves faster than they forgive anyone else. What mattered to her was not their memory of the past, but the shape of the present, that they came to her fence now not to mock and not to pity, but to ask, leaning their arms on the rail the very way old Bartek had always leaned on it, and talking with her of grass and water and the patient reading of land, and that when they spoke her name, now they spoke it plain and level, the way a person says the name of someone whose worth they have weighed in an honest hand and found to be real. She paid off the last of the $410 in the autumn that followed the drought, and she burned the bank's papers in the belly of the stove one cold evening, and she did not feel, watching the edges curl and blacken, any wish at all to crow over it. Being right, she had learned somewhere along the hard way, is its own kind of reply, and it needs no other voice added to it. Sarah Paul grew up on that green hill and never once left it, tending the flock she had named as a child, until her own hands went rough, and old Bartek Nowak lived long enough to see the bald grow so green that the county man himself came out with his instruments and drew an entirely new map of it and rode across the long shoulder of the hill. In his flat, careful surveyor's hand, the single word watered, which made the old man laugh, his dry stick laugh, until he had to sit down on a stone to catch his breath. He told her, near the very end of his long good life, sitting with her in the cool shade above the pool with the fat flock spread out on the slope below them, and the cold clear Seep weeping up out of the broken clay without end, that she had at last come to understand the one single thing he had ever truly been trying to teach her. "The land is never poor," he said to her once more, "only misread. And a person is never worthless, only underlooked. And the both of them together, the land, and the person alike will show you what they truly are. The very moment somebody has the patience to stop reading the surface of the thing and start instead to dig. And she thought about the $28 counted into the clerk's palm, and about the 65 bags of loose rattling bone that had lifted their noses toward a hill that nobody in the world wanted, and told her in the only language they had exactly where the quiet water was sleeping. She thought about how very close she had come in those dark counting years to believing the town's cruel arithmetic about her instead of trusting her own. And she looked down the long green slope at the pool the drought had never been able to touch, opened by the feet of animals the whole world had given up on, worked and stamped day after day after day, until the sealed clay at last broke apart, and the deep, slow, patient water came rising up to meet the light of the sun. And she understood that the whole of the tale had been, from that first jeer thrown at her across the auction rail, a single long and simple lesson in the difference between what a thing looks like to a careless eye and what a thing can truly do when it is given its chance. The Seep is running there still, the hill is green yet, and in that valley, even now, when someone is tempted to laugh at a person who has taken up the very thing that everyone else threw away as worthless, there is always some old voice near the fence that says, "Careful now, careful. Remember the widow and her starving sheep, and remember well what they stamped open in the driest of all the years."